Pax had eaten nothing since dawn. His last 3 portions were his dinner, his tomorrow, his only backup plan. And he gave all of it away to 3 strangers sitting in the rain like men who'd lost everything. He never asked who they were. What he didn't know was that those 3 broken men had once controlled an empire, and the moment he set those trays down without asking for a single thing in return, they decided, quietly, completely, and without discussion, that Pax Ellison was someone they would never let the world overlook again. If this kind of story makes your heart ache in the best way, tap subscribe. New chapters of stories like this drop every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. The rain had been falling for 2 hours straight when Pax Ellison pushed open the side door of his food stall and stepped out with 3 portions of everything he had left. 3 men sat slumped against the outer wall of the covered market, under the narrow overhang that barely kept the water off their shoulders. They weren't begging. They weren't even looking up. They just sat there, the kind of tired that lives in your bones after days without enough of anything. Pax didn't ask questions. He set the first tray down in front of the tallest one, the one with the sharp jaw and the dark circles carved so deep under his eyes they looked like bruises. Then the second tray went to the one in the middle, broad-shouldered and folded in on himself like he was trying to take up less space. The third went to the one on the end, who had a cut across his knuckles that hadn't been cleaned properly. "It's chicken stew and cornbread. It's still hot." The tall one looked up first. His eyes, dark gray, almost silver, landed on Pax's face with an intensity that most people would have stepped back from. Pax didn't step back. He just stood there, in his flour-dusted apron, water dripping off the brim of his cap, waiting. "You're giving this to us?" the tall one said. Not a question, more like he was checking that he'd heard right. "Yeah," Pax said. "Why?" Pax thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Because you look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday, and it's Friday." The broad-shouldered one in the middle made a sound, low, almost like a laugh, but rougher than that. The one on the end with the cut knuckles said nothing. He just reached for the tray with both hands and held it like it might disappear. Pax nodded once, then turned to go back inside. "Wait." He turned back. The tall one was on his feet now, and up close he was bigger than Pax had clocked from a distance, taller by almost a head, the kind of built that didn't come from a gym but from years of something harder. "What's your name?" the tall one asked. "Pax." A pause. Something shifted behind those silver-gray eyes, something that Pax couldn't name and didn't try to. "I'm Cade," the tall one said. Then, gesturing left, "That's my brother Holt," and right, "That's Roe." Brothers? Pax looked at the 3 of them again. Now that he was looking, yeah, the same cut of the jaw, the same way they held themselves even when they were exhausted, the same eyes, only in different shades. Cade's were gray, Holt's were darker, almost black, Roe's were a lighter brown, nearly amber. "Nice to meet you," Pax said, and meant it, even though that was a strange thing to mean at this particular moment, in the rain, outside a market stall, handing strangers the last of his food. He went back inside. The stall was called Pax's Table. It wasn't fancy. 8 plastic chairs, 4 folding tables, a hand-painted sign that Pax had done himself 3 years ago when he was 19. The letters were a little uneven on the right side because he'd run out of paint and had to thin the last bit with water. He'd never fixed them. He kind of liked the imperfection now. It reminded him that he'd started something with almost nothing, and it had kept standing. He cleaned the counter and packed up the last of the supplies. Friday nights were usually his best nights, but the rain had kept most people away. He'd served maybe 30 customers instead of his usual 75, and the 3 portions he'd just given away were, well, they were his own dinner. He'd figure it out. He always did. He was pulling on his jacket when the door opened and all 3 of them came in. Pax looked at the empty trays in Holt's hands. Holt set them on the counter with more care than the situation required, like he was returning something borrowed and wanted to show it hadn't been damaged.
"We wanted to," Cade started. Then he stopped, like the next word had gotten stuck somewhere between his chest and his mouth. He tried again. "That was the first real meal we've had in 4 days." Pax went very still. 4 days. He looked at them. Really looked. The way Roe's hands had a faint shake to them now that the tray wasn't there to hide it. The way Holt's jaw was tight, not from attitude, but from the kind of tension that came from holding yourself together for too long. The way Cade was standing like he was used to being in charge, but right now wasn't sure what charge even meant. "Sit down," Pax said. "We can't pay you," Roe started. "I didn't ask about payment. Sit down." They sat. Pax went back to the kitchen, the same kitchen he'd been about to lock up, and he made 3 more portions. Not stew this time because he'd used the last of that, but he had eggs, he had rice. He had half an onion and a can of black beans and enough butter to make it taste like something worth eating. He worked fast and quiet. In the dining area, the 3 brothers said almost nothing to each other, just the occasional low word, the rain on the roof. When he brought the food out, Rose stared at it like he didn't know what to do with kindness that kept arriving. "You don't have to keep," Cade said. "You already said that. It didn't stop me the first time," Pax said. Holt, who had said almost nothing, looked up from his plate and studied Pax with an expression that was hard to read. Dark eyes. Deliberate, like every look he gave cost something and he was deciding if Pax was worth the expense. Then he went back to eating. They stayed for an hour. Not talking much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable the way silences with strangers usually were. It had weight to it, but the good kind, the kind that meant everyone in the room was actually present. Pax cleaned up around them, wiped tables, stacked chairs, swept the floor. He wasn't performing busyness, he genuinely had closing tasks to do, and they didn't seem to need him to sit and watch them eat. They just needed to not be rained on, to have somewhere to be for a little while. At some point, Rose said, "You do this alone? Run the whole stall?" "Yeah," Pax said. "How long?" 3 years. Roe looked at the hand-painted sign. "The letters on the right are crooked, I know. I was going to say they look like they lean into the wind." Pax paused his sweeping and looked at the sign. Huh. He'd never thought of it that way. "I ran out of paint," he said. "Happy accident," Rose said, and he almost smiled. It didn't quite finish forming, like his face had forgotten the complete motion, but the beginning of it was there. When they finally got up to leave, Cade stood in the doorway for a moment. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The market around them was dark and quiet, most of the other stalls locked up for the night. "Pax?" "Yeah." "We'll be back." He said it simply, not as a threat, though Pax would later think about the fact that it could have been read that way, coming from a man who looked like Cade. It was a statement, like a fact he was sharing. "Okay," Pax said, and then they were gone. 3 tall figures disappearing into the wet dark, and Pax locked up his stall and walked home and ate a bowl of plain rice standing over his sink. He didn't think too hard about any of it. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in weeks. He didn't know why. They came back the next morning. Pax was still setting up, hadn't even flipped the sign to open, when he heard the knock. 3 of them, standing in the early gray light, looking considerably less like people who'd been through something terrible. They'd slept, changed clothes. Roe had cleaned the cut on his knuckles. Cade held out a paper bag. "Groceries for what you used last night." Pax looked at the bag. "You didn't have to." "We know," Holt said flatly. "We wanted to." It was the first full sentence Pax had heard from Holt. It landed differently than he expected. Blunt, but not unkind, like Holt just didn't have extra words, and the ones he did use he meant completely. Pax took the bag. He looked inside. Eggs, a full carton, butter, 2 cans of black beans, a large bag of rice, everything he used and more. "This is," he started. "Exactly what you had," Cade said. "We checked the labels in the recycling bin outside." Pax stared at him. "You checked my recycling bin?" "We're thorough," Rose said, and this time the almost smile made it a little further towards completion. Pax let them in.
They came back every morning after that. Not always together. Sometimes it was just Roe in the early hours before anyone else arrived, perching on a stool at the counter and watching Pax prep with that almost smile that never quite fully landed. Sometimes it was Holt, who would sit in the corner with a notebook and write things down in a small, cramped script that Pax didn't try to read. Sometimes it was Cade, who arrived precisely when the lunch rush started, not to eat, but to help. Pax hadn't asked for help, But Cade was fast and he was organized, and the first time he quietly restacked Pax's supply shelf in a way that made the workflow 30% easier, Pax had stood and looked at it for a full minute and then said, "How did you—" "Logistics," Cade said. "It's what I know." "From where?" A short pause, not evasive, more like he was choosing the right size of truth. "Family business." Pax didn't push. That was the thing about Pax. He didn't push. He'd grown up in a house where pushing questions at people was how you made them leave, and he'd learned early that if you made a space quiet enough and safe enough, people would eventually fill it themselves. He made the space. He waited. It was Roe who filled it first. 3 weeks after the night in the rain, on a slow Tuesday morning, Roe was sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee that had gone cold because he'd forgotten to drink it, and he said, without looking up from the counter, "We used to have more." Pax was chopping onions. He kept chopping. "More what?" he asked. "Everything." Roe traced a finger along a scratch in the counter's surface. Our family runs a business, has for 3 generations. Last year something went wrong. We lost a lot. People we trusted turned out to be—" He stopped. Started again. "We had to leave, just us 3, and for a while it was bad." "The night I met you?" "Yeah." Pax set down the knife. He turned and leaned against the opposite counter, arms crossed loosely. Not defensive, just settled, listening. "You didn't ask who we were before you fed us," Roe said. He finally looked up. His amber eyes were tired in a different way than they'd been that first night. Not physically tired, the other kind. "Didn't matter who you were before. You were hungry. That's all I needed to know." Roe looked at him for a long moment. "That's a rare thing," he said. "Is it?" "Yes." No hesitation. "Most people want context. They want to know if you deserve the thing they're offering." Pax thought about that. Food isn't something you have to deserve. Roe was quiet for a while. Then, "Cade thinks about you constantly, you know." Pax blinked. "What?" He said, "After that night, he didn't sleep. He kept saying, 'Who does that? Who just—'" He couldn't finish the sentence. Roe turned his coffee cup in slow circles. "Holt didn't say anything, but Holt never says anything. That doesn't mean he wasn't." The door opened and Holt walked in, and Roe stopped talking mid-sentence with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing that whole his life. Holt looked at both of them. "I'm interrupting." Not a question. He always did that, stated questions like they were observations. "No," Pax said. "Coffee?" "Yes," Holt said. He sat down next to Roe and opened his notebook, and for a while the 3 of them existed in the same space without words, just the sound of the knife resuming its work, the scratch of Holt's pen, Roe finally drinking his cold coffee like he decided imperfect was fine. Pax thought about what Roe had said. "Cade thinks about you constantly," and then firmly put it in a box in the back of his mind and pushed the box to a shelf and turned his attention back to the onions. He was very practiced at this. Quick pause. If you're already feeling something for these 4, you're not alone. Subscribe so you're here when the next chapter drops. This story is just getting started. The thing about Cade was that he noticed everything. Not in the way that felt like surveillance, though Pax had been around people whose attention felt like being watched through glass. Cade's noticing was different. It was the kind that made you feel seen rather than observed. He noticed, for instance, that Pax always served himself last. That when the lunch rush hit and the stall was loud and full, Pax moved through it with a kind of focused calm that looked effortless, but wasn't. You could see the calculation in his eyes, the constant tracking of what needed doing. That there was a chair in the back corner of the kitchen that Pax never sat in. That Pax's coat, which hung on the hook by the door, had a small tear along the left sleeve that had been carefully, almost invisibly, mended with stitching in a slightly different shade of gray. Cade noticed all of this without comment, until the day he said, quietly, while they were stacking chairs after the last customer had left, "You mended your coat." Pax looked at the sleeve. "Yeah, last winter. The thread is a different color." "I know, it was the closest I had." Cade was quiet for a moment, then, "It looks intentional, like it's supposed to be there." Pax looked at the sleeve again, the gray-on-gray stitching, subtle as a whisper. "You're good at finding the version of things that works," Cade said, and he didn't look at Pax when he said it. He was looking at the coat, but something about the words had a weight to them that wasn't really about the coat at all. Pax didn't know what to say, so he said, "Help me with the last table?" and Cade did. The fourth week was when things shifted. It started on a Wednesday, market inspection day, which Pax dreaded every month because the inspector, a man named Garrett, had a habit of finding problems that Pax was fairly sure weren't actually problems, but that Garrett wrote up with great enthusiasm anyway. This month, Garrett informed Pax that the ventilation unit above the cooking station had a concerning rattle and needed to be assessed by a licensed technician before Pax could continue operating. He handed Pax a form. He seemed very pleased about the form. Pax stood holding the form after Garrett left, doing the math in his head. Technician call-out fee, parts if it needed any, lost revenue from however many days he couldn't operate. He ran the numbers 3 times and they kept coming out the same way. Numbers that meant he'd have to close for at least a week, and closing for a week meant, "What's that?" He looked up. Holt was there, which, fair, Holt was there most mornings, it wasn't unusual, but today he'd arrived while Pax was calculating and Pax had been too deep in it to hear the door. "Inspection report," Pax said. He handed it over because it seemed easier than explaining it. Holt read it. He read it twice. Then he took out his phone, made a call, 3 sentences all in the same low, matter-of-fact tone, and hung up. "There'll be a technician here in an hour," he said. "A what? How?" "I know a company. They're good. They won't find anything that isn't there, and they'll charge a fair rate." "Holt, I can't just—" "You fed us for 4 weeks," Holt said. "Not unkindly, just plainly. Let someone do something about a ventilation unit." "That's not the same as—" "I know it's not the same." He set the report back on the counter. "I'm not trying to balance accounts. I just know someone who can fix your problem today, so I called them." Pax looked at him. Holt met the look without flinching. He wasn't asking for thanks, and he wasn't performing generosity. He'd seen a problem, he had a solution, and he applied the solution. That was all. "Okay," Pax said. "Okay. And then, do you have coffee?" "I always have coffee." "Good." The technician, a tall, efficient man named Doyle who barely spoke, arrived exactly 58 minutes later, assessed the ventilation unit in 20 minutes, tightened 2 loose bolts, cleaned a filter that had become partially blocked, and handed Pax a bill that was a third of what he'd feared. Pax paid it. After Doyle left, he sat down in one of the plastic chairs and breathed for a moment. Holt was still in the corner with his notebook. He didn't look up. "Thank you," Pax said. "I already said that. I know, I meant it more this time." A pause. Holt's pen stopped moving for just a moment, then started again. "You don't have to be surprised every time someone helps you. That's not—" He stopped. "It's not right that you're surprised." Pax thought about that. "I grew up being more of the helper than the helped." "I know." Holt looked up, dark eyes, steady. "It shows." There was nothing unkind in that, just observation, but it sat with Pax for the rest of the day. Cade came in late that afternoon, already mid-sentence with someone on his phone, talking in the low, rapid way he had when he was handling something complicated. He held up one finger at Pax, "Give me a minute," and stepped back outside. Pax watched him through the window. The gesture had been so instinctively considerate, the acknowledgement of Pax's presence, the choice not to take the call loudly in someone else's space, that Pax had to consciously redirect himself before he started cataloging other things he'd noticed about Cade. He was getting better at redirecting. He wasn't sure if it was working. Cade came back in and sat at the counter and said, "Sorry, business." "The family business?" "Yeah." He drummed his fingers once. Not nervous, just thinking. Things are getting more stable. Slowly. We're getting back to where we should be." "That's good," Pax said. "It is." A pause. "It means we'll be less around. Soon. When things fully get going again, we won't be in this part of town much." Pax absorbed this. He flipped the cloth over his shoulder and went back to wiping down the counter. "Makes sense?" "Pax. Yeah. I said less around. Not gone." Pax looked up. Cade was looking at him with that silver-gray gaze, the one that noticed things. "I don't say things I don't mean." "I know," Pax said, quietly. "Okay then." Cade stood. "The supply shelf needs restocking. 3rd section from the left is running low." He went and restocked it himself. Pax stood there for a second, then started laughing, very softly, to himself. That was the most Cade thing Cade had ever done. Just state the important thing and then immediately pivot to the practical thing so nobody had to figure out what to do with the feeling. Pax understood this impulse completely. It was exactly what he would have done. That evening, after closing, all three brothers were there, which didn't happen often on weekdays. They'd brought food this time, which was also unusual. A large bag from a Thai place 3 blocks over. Noodles, spring rolls, something that smelled like lemongrass and made Pax's whole kitchen feel suddenly warmer. "We celebrate when things go right," Rose said, spreading containers across the table. "The deal we've been working on for 6 weeks. It closed today." "That's... congratulations," Pax said. "Sit down," Rose said. "You're eating with us." "I have cleanup to..." "Holt already cleaned up," Rose said. Pax looked back. The kitchen was, yes, spotless. Holt was sitting with his notebook like he hadn't just cleaned an entire commercial kitchen in the time it took Roe to arrange containers. Pax sat down. And he ate with them. Actually ate. Not serving, not managing, not tracking what needed doing next. Just ate and listened to Roe tell a story about the deal that turned out to be equal parts funny and improbable, and watched Holt eat noodles with the same focused seriousness he applied to everything. And noticed the way Cade laughed. Rare, genuine, slightly reluctant, like he was surprised each time that laughter still worked in his body. It was the best meal Pax had eaten in months. Maybe longer. After, they washed the containers and threw them away, and then they all just sat. The market was closed and quiet. The rain from their first night had given way to a dry autumn, and through the stall's small window, Pax could see the orange dark sky of evening, the lit windows of the buildings across the way. It was Roe who said it. "We told some people about you." Pax looked up from his coffee cup. What people?" "Business contacts. People who eat out, buy lunch, need somewhere good. You'll probably have some new regulars next week." Roe's tone was careful. He knew he was announcing something that Pax hadn't asked for. "If that's not, we can walk it back." "But..." "No," Pax said. He didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Why?" "Because your food is exceptional," Cade said, simply. "And because you deserve a full house. And because..." He stopped himself just short of something. Pax waited. Cade looked at the table, then at the hand-painted sign, then at Pax. "Because you made room for us," Cade said, "when you had almost nothing. The least we can do is make sure more people find their way to your table." The word sat in the air between them. Pax didn't know what to do with the way his chest felt right then, like something was expanding in there that had been held very small for a very long time. He looked down at his coffee cup because looking at Cade's face while feeling that way seemed like a dangerous activity. "Thank you," he said, quietly. "Okay then." Cade stood. "The supply shelf needs restocking. 3rd section from the left is running low." He went and restocked it himself. Pax stood there for a second, then started laughing, very softly, to himself. That was the most Cade thing Cade had ever done. Just state the important thing and then immediately pivot to the practical thing so nobody had to figure out what to do with the feeling. Pax understood this impulse completely. It was exactly what he would have done. The next regalia started arriving the following Monday. Not a flood, more like a steady stream. Professionals in work clothes, a few younger guys who had clearly been told by someone they trusted, a man in his 60s who came in on Tuesday, sat down, ordered the stew, ate every drop, and said on his way out, "I'll be back Thursday." He came back Thursday. He came back the Thursday after that. Eventually, Pax learned his name was Frank, and he lived 2 streets over and had been eating the same sad vending machine sandwich for lunch every day for 3 years because he'd never known there was anything better within walking distance. The stall got busier. Pax got busier. And Cade, who'd warned him about being less around, somehow found himself at Pax's table almost as often as before. Pax noticed a difference in Cade as the weeks went on. He was harder to pin down than his brothers in some ways. Roe was easy to read once you learned his language, and Holt was consistent enough to map. But Cade had layers that he'd built deliberately, and he didn't dismantle them quickly or carelessly. What Pax noticed was this. The tension that Cade always carried in his shoulders, like he was braced for impact, loosened slightly when he was at the stall. Not gone, but easier. And Cade was always the last one to leave. Not always obviously. Sometimes he'd have a reason, a question about the supply order or a practical suggestion, but the reason was always thin enough that Pax, who was perceptive about practical things, could see the seam of it. And then Cade would finally say goodnight and stand in the doorway for a beat too long and then actually leave. Pax did not examine what he thought about this. He was very good at not examining things. The thing he hadn't told any of them, the thing he hadn't told anyone in years, really, was about his health. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't immediately dangerous, but Pax had a condition called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which meant his heart rate did unusual things when he stood up, and when he was dehydrated or stressed or hadn't eaten right, he got dizzy, sometimes badly. He managed it. He drank electrolytes, he kept crackers under the counter. He knew his limits. He mostly knew his limits. The day he overestimated himself was a Thursday, a busy one, Frank's Day, plus the lunch rush was running 20 minutes long because a local office had apparently ordered from him for a team lunch, and Pax had been on his feet for 8 hours with one 15-minute break and hadn't drunk enough water because he kept meaning to and then didn't. He felt it coming, the way he always did, a slight dimming at the edges of his vision, a too quick flutter in his chest. He put his hand on the counter, he took 3 slow breaths, he thought, just 5 more minutes and the rush will clear. He made it 4 minutes. He didn't fall, he slid, one hand still on the counter, down to sitting on the kitchen floor which he'd cleaned that morning, and he sat there with his back against the counter and concentrated on breathing until the dizziness peaked and started to ease. He was alone in the kitchen. He was fine. He was always fine. He'd been managing this for 6 years. Except the door to the kitchen opened, and Cade walked in. He did that now, walked into the kitchen without knocking, which Pax had not objected to because he didn't mind, and which he currently deeply minded because this was not how he wanted to be found. Cade stopped. He looked at Pax on the floor. His expression shifted. Not panic, but something fast and focused and very intent. He was on the floor next to Pax in 3 seconds. "What happened?" he said. Again, not a question. Observation. "I'm fine," Pax said. "You're on the floor." I sat down. "On the kitchen floor?" "Yes." Cade looked at him for a long moment. Then, without any of the exclamation or alarm that most people brought to these moments, he said, "What do you need?" Not "what's wrong," not "should I call someone," not "why didn't you tell me?" "What do you need?" Pax felt something crack open in his chest at that, the specific, precise kindness of the right question. "Water," he said, "and there's a bag of crackers on the second shelf." Cade got up. He got the water and the crackers. He came back and sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor next to Pax and handed him both without commentary. Pax ate 3 crackers, drank the water slowly, felt the world stabilize. "POTS," he said after a minute. "I don't know what that is." "It's a nervous system thing. My heart rate doesn't regulate well when I stand up. I get dizzy if I push too hard. I manage it most of the time." He kept his voice flat and factual, the way he'd learned to talk about it when he didn't want people to panic. "Today I didn't manage it great." Cade absorbed this. "Is it not dangerous mostly, more annoying?" Cade nodded once. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you had it?" 6 years. "And you've been running this stall alone for 3. "Yes." "And nobody—" He stopped himself. Redirected. "Okay." Pax looked at him sideways. "You can ask." "I know." Cade met his gaze. "I'm deciding whether it would be useful or whether it would just make you feel like you owe me an explanation you shouldn't have to give." Pax stared. "That is a very specific consideration." "I think about things before I say them," Cade said, plainly. "I know. I've noticed." A pause. They were both sitting on the kitchen floor, backs against the counter, and the lunch rush noise had faded outside, and the light through the small window was that particular gold afternoon that made ordinary things look important. "I'm going to ask Holt to come in some mornings, not to replace anything you do, just so you have someone here. I don't need—" I know you don't need it. I need it. Pax went quiet. That was different. That wasn't let me help you because you need help. That was let me do this because not doing it will bother me. Okay, Pax said. Okay. Cade stood up. He extended a hand.
Pax took it, and Cade pulled him up. Steady, no extra force, just enough, and didn't let go for a beat longer than necessary. Then he did let go, and he picked up the cracker bag and put it back on the shelf, and he said, "The third table needs wiping." "I'll do it," Pax said. "I know." Cade went to do it anyway. Holt started coming in mornings. He didn't make a thing of it. He just arrived and existed in the space in a way that was useful without being intrusive. He learned where everything was, and he stocked it. He was efficient in a way that felt like language, like the particular way he arranged things was a form of communication that Pax was slowly learning to read. On the third morning, Holt said, "Roe told you that Cade thinks about you." Pax kept stirring the pot. "He did." "Holt talks too much." "He was being kind." A pause. "Yes," Holt said. "He was." He set a stack of plates on the shelf with a precise click. "Cade doesn't—" Another pause. Longer. "He doesn't do this. Come back somewhere. Let a place become somewhere he returns to." He lined up the cups. "Our life hasn't allowed for that. Returning." Pax turned down the heat on the pot. He waited. "He returned here," Holt said. "Every day, for over a month." He turned around. "I'm telling you this not so you'll do anything about it, but so you understand what it means." Pax looked at him. "Holt," he said slowly, "are you—" "I'm letting you know the information," Holt said. "What you do with it is your decision." And he went back to stacking plates like he hadn't just said something that rearranged the furniture of Pax's entire inner landscape. Pax did not confront any of this directly. He wasn't built for confronting feelings head-on. He was built for sitting with them in the dark and turning them over very slowly and occasionally feeding them crackers until they made sense. What he knew, Cade came back every day. Cade noticed the mended thread and the crooked letters and the last-served self and the dizziness on the kitchen floor. Cade asked, "What do you need?" instead of "What happened?" Cade held his hand one beat longer than necessary. What Pax felt about all of this was large, too large to look at directly, the way you couldn't look straight at the sun. What Pax did about all of this was make very good food and keep the stall running and try not to drop anything when Cade walked through the door. The thing that changed everything happened on a Sunday. The stall was closed on Sundays, Pax's one day off, which he spent doing prep work for the week, shopping for supplies, and occasionally sitting by the window of his apartment with a book he never quite got through. He was at the market, the big one on 5th, picking through tomatoes with the focused intensity of someone who took tomatoes seriously, when he heard raised voices. Not unusual for a market, lots of people, small spaces, occasional friction. But one of the voices was Cade's. Pax looked up. 20 feet away, Cade was talking to a man Pax had never seen, thick-set, overdressed for a market, the kind of face that suggested he was used to being taken seriously and was not currently being taken seriously. The man was pointing a finger in a way that was technically not threatening, but was very much meant to feel threatening. Cade was not flinching, but something in his posture, that permanent brace, had pulled tighter and his jaw was set in a way Pax had never seen before, and his eyes had gone to a different kind of gray, the kind right before a storm. Roe was there too, just to Cade's left, completely still in that way he had when he was preparing for something. Holt was, Pax scanned, on the other side of the overdressed man, positioned so that if anything happened, the three brothers formed a triangle. It was so smooth it looked unconscious, but clearly wasn't. These three knew how to handle situations. Pax stood very still, with 2 tomatoes in each hand. Then, the overdressed man said something, low, fast, close to Cade's face, and Cade took one step backward, and Pax could see, from 20 feet away, exactly what that step cost him. The deliberate choice to step back instead of forward, the control it required. Before he thought about it, Pax was walking over. He arrived at Cade's shoulder and said, "Hey."
in the exact tone he used when a customer at the stall was starting to become a problem for other customers. Not aggressive, just present. All four of them looked at him. "You're Pax," the overdressed man said, not a greeting. Pax registered the fact that this stranger knew his name and filed it for later. "Yeah, you mind if we finish this in like 10 minutes? I need Cade's help picking tomatoes and I'm bad at it alone." A beat. Then Cade said, low, quick, like he was picking up a cue, "I told you the heirlooms, Pax. They're right there." "They're all the same," Pax said with great conviction. "They're not. They look the same. They're not." The overdressed man looked between them. Something in his face recalibrated, uncertain now, thrown off by the complete normalcy of the exchange. His finger uncurled. His posture lost its edge by a degree. "We'll continue this," he said to Cade, still trying for threatening. "Sure," Cade said, evenly. The man left. Pax waited until he was gone. Then he held out both tomatoes. "Which one's better?"
Cade looked at them. A long pause. Then he made a sound, low and genuine and caught off guard, that was the closest thing Pax had ever seen to him actually laughing from surprise. "That one," Cade said, pointing. Rowe had his face turned away. His shoulders were definitely shaking. Holt looked at Pax with those dark, evaluating eyes, and then, very quietly, he said, "Good call. Real quick, if you want to know how this ends, and trust me, you do, subscribe. This channel is where these stories live, and this one has a long way left to go." They walked through the farmer's market together, all four of them, and Pax asked no questions about the man and what he'd said, and Cade offered no explanations, and by some unspoken agreement, that was apparently fine. What was not fine, Pax found out 30 minutes later, was the look on Cade's face when they sat down at a bench near the fruit stalls and Cade said, "He knew your name." "I noticed," Pax said. "That's—" Cade pressed his hands flat on the table. "That means someone connected you to us, which means—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I need you to understand something. Our family business had people who wanted to dismantle it. We've been rebuilding, and some of those people haven't been happy about that. I thought we'd kept our current operations separate enough that the people we care about wouldn't be—" He stopped again. "The people we care about." He'd said it without stopping to choose a safer word. Pax noted this with the careful attention he gave to everything important. "Cade?" Pax said. Cade looked at him. "I'm not scared," Pax said. "You should be, a little." "Maybe." Pax set down his bag of tomatoes. "But I was more scared a year ago when I didn't know how I was going to keep the stall open for another month, and I got through that." He looked at Cade steadily. I'm not delicate. I know I look like—" He gestured at himself, at the slight frame and the quiet and whatever else people read off him at first glance. "But I've been holding my own table together for 3 years. I can handle knowing that the situation exists." Cade was very still. "I know you're not delicate," he said, low, like it mattered that Pax understood he meant it. "I've never thought that." "Then stop making the face where you look like you're trying to figure out how to keep me away from the difficult parts." A long pause. "That's a specific face. You have it right now." Cade looked away, looked back. The face very slowly changed. Something underneath it arrived that was more honest and more unguarded and considerably harder to look at. "Fair," he said. "Yeah," Pax said. They sat with that for a minute. Then Holt said from 3 feet away where he'd been standing silently, "Can we get lunch? I'm hungry." And somehow that was exactly the right thing, and the moment shifted into something that wasn't quite the same shape it had been before, but was easier to carry. The man from the market was named Dex Moreland. Cade told Pax this 4 days later, sitting at the counter at the end of the day, when the stall was empty and the light was the color of late afternoon. He told it plainly, the way Holt talked, no extra ornamentation, just the shape of the thing. Moreland had been a partner in the Aldrin Group, the three brothers' family business, named for their grandfather. 3 generations ago, their grandfather had built it from nothing, a logistics operation, supply chains, high-end distribution networks, legal, profitable, rooted.
18 months ago, Moreland had begun quietly redirecting funds, rerouting contracts to his own subsidiary companies. When the brothers found out, Cade found out first because Cade always found out, Moreland had been prepared. He'd gotten ahead of it, twisted the story, leveraged relationships the brothers hadn't known were compromised, and for a brutal 6-week period, the Aldrin Group had been effectively paralyzed. "We lost the main office," Cade said, "the accounts, most of our operating staff, because they needed salaries and we couldn't pay them." He traced the ring a coffee cup had left on the counter. "We were down to the 3 of us and a laptop and whatever cash we had on hand, which wasn't much. Which is why," Pax started, "which is why we were sitting outside your stall in the rain, yes." Pax was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "Now we've rebuilt enough to be a problem for him again, hence the market." Cade's voice was level, but Pax could hear the weight under it, the months of work that had gone into enough. "You used my name to rattle him," Pax said.
"Yes. Does he know—" Pax stopped himself. Cade met his eyes. "Does he know what you are to us? What you are to us?" Again, the unguarded phrasing. Cade spoke in precision and restraint about almost everything, and then sometimes he said something like that, completely direct, like the words had decided to bypass whatever gate usually operated. "What am I to you?" Pax asked, quietly, not challenging, genuinely asking. Cade was quiet for a long time, not because he didn't know the answer. Pax understood that, could see the answer being assembled behind those gray eyes, each piece carefully fitted to the next. "When we were at our worst," Cade said at last, "you gave us food and called it nothing special. When you were at your worst, on the kitchen floor, you let me sit next to you. Every day since I first walked in here, I've come back not because I needed to, but because—" He exhaled, slow. "I come back because it's where I want to be. This stall. You in it." He looked at the hand-painted sign. "I don't do that. I don't attach to places, or I haven't, not in a long time. We've moved too much and lost too much, and I learned to keep things light." He looked back at Pax. "This isn't light." The words landed so carefully that Pax needed a moment before he could say anything at all. "It isn't for me either," he said. Cade held his gaze. "I don't know," Cade said slowly, "how to do this, whatever this is. I haven't done it before. I've managed empires, and I'm telling you I don't know how to—" He stopped. There was something that might have been exasperation, might have been wonder. "You make it very hard to keep my distance. Since the first night. You stayed until I kicked you out," Pax said. "I wasn't going to leave until I knew you were okay. You didn't know me." "No," Cade said, "but I wanted to." Pax looked at his hands on the counter. He thought about the mended coat, the crooked letters, the kitchen floor, the tomatoes. He thought about how he'd spent 22 years getting very good at being alone and being fine with that. He looked up. "I opened at 7, he said. A beat. "I know," Cade said. "If you're here at 6:30, I can show you how the supply order works, before anyone else gets here." Another beat, longer. "You want to show me the supply order. I want to give you a reason to be here before 6:30. He held Cade's gaze steadily. "Which I think you already have, but I thought it might be easier to call it the supply order." Cade looked at him for a long moment. Then, finally, fully, he laughed, genuine and unguarded and real in a way Pax had only glimpsed before. It changed his face completely, pulled it open like a window. "Yeah," Cade said when he'd collected himself. "Okay. Okay," Pax said. Cade was there at 6:28. He stood in the doorway with 2 coffees from the place on the corner and looked at Pax like he wasn't quite sure whether to feel ridiculous or not. "The supply order?" Cade said. "The supply order," Pax agreed. He taught Cade the supply order. They went through it carefully, systematically, because Pax was a person who did practical things with precision, and this was actually useful information, even if both of them understood that the supply order was not the actual reason they were standing together in the quiet of 6:30 a.m., the stall still closed, 2 coffees getting less hot by the minute. At 6:59, Pax said, "And the vegetable delivery comes on Tuesday, which is why I prep ahead on Monday." And Cade said, "Pax," and Pax stopped talking.
And Cade said, with the same direct honesty he'd used at the counter, "I've been coming back every day because of you, not the stall. You." "I know," Pax said. "Is that—" Cade stopped, started again. "Is that something you want? Because I'm aware of what our situation is, the business, Moreland, all of it. It's not—" He set his coffee down. "I'm not offering you easy. I run a food stall alone with a heart condition. I don't need easy." Cade blinked. "I need real," Pax said. "I've had easy. Easy is people who stay until things get complicated and then leave. Real is harder, and I want it anyway." He held Cade's gaze. "You came back every day. You sat on the kitchen floor. You noticed my coat. I noticed everything too, Cade. I've been noticing you since the first night. The rain, the trays, the gray eyes looking up at him. So yes, that's something I want." The silence in the stall was very full. Cade reached across the counter. Not grabbing, not sudden, just a deliberate movement, and took Pax's hand in both of his, held it. That was all, but the warmth of it ran all the way up Pax's arm and settled somewhere near his sternum, and stayed there. "Okay," Cade said. "Yeah," Pax said. At 7:03, the first customer knocked. Pax squeezed Cade's hand once and let go, and he flipped the sign to open, and Cade, without being asked, went and restocked the third section from the left, which had been running low again.
The Moreland case moved slowly, the way these things always did through proper channels. But it moved. Cade and his brothers had done it correctly, every step documented, every claim evidenced, nothing that could be unwound with a clever argument. And in the meantime, Pax's table kept growing. Not explosively. Pax wasn't looking for explosive. He was looking for sustainable. But the regulars multiplied steadily, and on a Tuesday in November, Pax hired his first employee, a 19-year-old named Theo, who was fast and cheerful and almost as precise in the kitchen as Pax himself. Theo had applied with a handwritten note that said, at the bottom, "I heard the chicken stew is worth working for." Pax had hired him on the spot. "You hired someone," Holt said, the first morning Theo was there. "I did," Pax said. Holt watched Theo move through the kitchen for a moment. Then he said, "Good." He sat down in his corner with his notebook. "He doesn't bite," Pax told Theo later. "He hasn't bit me yet," Theo said cheerfully, "though he did rearrange the whole spice shelf while I was on my break, so—" Pax looked at the spice shelf. It was, objectively, better organized than it had been. "Yeah," Pax said, "he does that." The thing that caught Pax off guard, even though he shouldn't have been caught off guard given everything he knew by now, was the gift. It wasn't a big gift, that was the thing. It was small, and it was specific, and that was why it undid him completely. It was a small tin of paint, exactly the right shade of gray. Not a note, not an explanation, just the tin, left on the counter on a morning when Pax arrived before Cade, which almost never happened. Pax stood holding it. He looked at the sign, the letters leaning into the wind on the right side. He thought about what Roe had said, happy accident. He thought about what he'd always thought, that he'd run out of paint and something had been imperfect, and he'd learned to call it good enough. He thought about the fact that whoever had left this tin had noticed something he'd almost stopped seeing. When Cade arrived at 6:29, Pax was sitting on the counter with the tin in his hands, waiting. Cade stopped inside the door. He looked at the tin. He looked at Pax's face. He was quiet. "You left this," Pax said. "Yes. You went and found the exact shade." "It took a while," Cade said. "Not proud of it, just accurate." "Why?" Pax asked. Cade came to the counter. He leaned against it, next to Pax, close enough that their arms almost touched. He looked at the sign. "Because you were going to repaint those letters to match," he said. "I could see it in the way you looked at them after Rose said what he said, like you were planning to fix the imperfection." He paused. "I wanted you to be able to choose. Either fix it or leave it. Both should be your choice. But I wanted it available." Pax looked at the tin. He looked at the sign. He set the tin down, very carefully, on the shelf under the register where he kept the things he was keeping. He kept the tin. He left the letters leaning into the wind. Cade was watching him when he turned around. "You're keeping the imperfection," Cade said. Roe was right. "It looks like it's going somewhere." He met Cade's eyes. "Like us." Something settled in Cade's expression. The very last of the bracing, the very last of the long-held readiness for impact, and what replaced it was quieter and more honest than anything Pax had seen there before. "Yeah," Cade said. "Yeah," Pax said. December arrived with the particular cold that turned the market into something that looked like a movie set. All lit stalls and steaming breath and the smell of roasted things. Pax strung lights along the overhang of the stall, small white ones. The market did it collectively every year, but each vendor chose their own arrangement, and Pax went with the simple approach, a single line, clean. Cade looked at them on the evening Pax put them up. "More," he said. "What?" "They need more." He studied the arrangement with the focused practicality he gave to logistics problems. One line disappears. You need 3, offset, so they catch each other's light. Pax looked at the single line. He thought, "That's a different aesthetic than I was going for." He thought, "He's completely right. Go get more lights." He went and got more lights. They strung them together in the early evening cold, the market still buzzing around them. Pax on the ladder he kept in the storage corner, Cade handing him lights from below, and occasionally directing minor adjustments with an authority that Pax found both slightly exasperating and deeply endearing.
Roe came by at some point and watched for 3 minutes and said, "This is the best thing I've ever seen," in a tone suggesting he wasn't only talking about the lights. Holt came and looked and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "The left section is lower than the right." "By design," Cade said. Holt looked at it longer. "Okay," he said, and he sounded for just a moment like he was doing what Pax had done with the letters, choosing to call the asymmetry intentional. The Algin Group's formal recovery was completed in the second week of December. Moreland's case was in the hands of people with subpoena power and a lot of patience for financial documentation. He was not, as Roe had predicted, having an easy time. The 3 brothers didn't celebrate extravagantly, that wasn't their way. But they took a night off and came to Pax's table at closing time, and Pax made the best version of everything he knew how to make. And Theo stayed to help serve, because he'd figured out by now what the 3 brothers were to Pax and had opinions about marking the occasion. They ate together, 4 of them, plus Theo, who pulled up a stool and ate from a bowl balanced on his knee, and talked 19 to the dozen about everything except the business, which everyone appreciated. At the end of the night, Rose said, with the directness he'd learned to use for things that mattered, "Thank you, Pax, for this, for all of it." Pax shook his head. "You bought groceries." "You fed us when we had nothing," Rose said. "You didn't do it to gain something. You didn't even know who we were." His amber eyes were earnest in a way Pax didn't often see from him. Usually Roe was quick and light, the way very feeling people sometimes made themselves in order to manage the volume of what they felt. That kind of thing, he stopped, started again. "We've met a lot of people, in business, growing up, all of it. Very few of them were actually just good. You're just good, Pax. It's rare." Pax didn't know what to do with this, so he looked at his hands. Holt said, "He can't take compliments." "I can take compliments." "You're looking at the table," Holt said. "I'm looking at my hands. Same problem." Theo made a sound of delight and covered his mouth. Pax looked up. He looked at Roe. He held the look steadily even though it cost something. "Thank you," he said, "for saying that. I don't always know if the way I do things is... I just do what makes sense to me. I don't always know if it reads as good or just as strange." "Both," Rose said. "It's both. Beautifully." Cade and Pax were the last ones there, the way it always seemed to go now. Theo had left with cheerful ceremony. Roe and Holt had gone ahead, Holt pausing in the doorway to give Pax a look that communicated something he didn't have the words for, but that Pax by now could read. "This is right. We're glad it's here." Pax wiped down the last table. "You're going to stop," Cade said from the place at the counter. "Wiping?" "Wiping and doing the 2 more things reflex. You wipe everything twice when you're thinking." Pax looked at the cloth in his hand. "I didn't know you'd notice that." "I notice everything about you," Cade said. "Completely matter of fact. Not performing it, just stating it. I have since the first night." Pax set the cloth down. He came to stand at the counter, across from Cade, the same position they'd stood on 100 evenings now. The lights, strung in 3 offset lines across the overhang outside, sent small reflections through the window, caught on the counter's surface, caught in Cade's gray eyes. "I used to think," said Pax slowly, that people like me didn't get the... I thought there was a version of life where I kept the stall going, and I had regulars who mattered to me, and that was it. That was the whole thing, and I was okay with that." Cade was watching him carefully. "I'm not saying I wasn't okay. I am. But I'd drawn a circle around what I let myself want because wanting more than the circle meant possibly losing the things inside it." He looked at his hands on the counter. "You walked in from the rain and sat on my kitchen floor and noticed my coat and brought back the exact shade of paint. And somewhere in all of that, I lost track of the circle." "Good," Cade said. "Good," Pax agreed.
"I don't want you inside a circle," Cade said. His voice was low and certain, the voice he used when he'd thought something through completely. "I want—" He paused. "I've spent a year getting my life back to what it should be. The group, the operations, all of it. And every part of that process, the thing I came back to, not the business. You." He met Pax's eyes. "You're what I rebuilt toward. I don't know if that's... I know that's a significant thing to say. I'm saying it anyway." The small stall was quiet. Outside, the market lights, the cold December air against the window. Inside, something that had been built so carefully and without performance, one morning at a time, one honest word at a time, had arrived at the place it was always going. "I'll still be here at 7, Pax said. Cade's mouth curved. "I'll be here at 6:28. 6:25, Pax said. "There's more to teach you." "About the supply order?" "About everything." Cade reached across the counter, the same deliberate movement, unhurried, and this time he didn't just take Pax's hand. He held it in both of his and stayed there, and Pax turned his hand over and held back. They stood like that, in the light and the quiet, while outside the December city moved around them, and Pax's table, with its crooked letters and 3-lined lights and imperfect sign that leaned into the wind like something going somewhere, held them both inside its walls. 3 months later, in a cold, early March, a reporter from a local small business outlet came to do a profile on Pax's table. She asked Pax what he'd attribute the stall's growth to. He thought about it for a genuine moment. "Regulars who brought other regulars," he said, "and a good supply shelf." Behind her, at the counter, Cade made the sound that was his version of a laugh. Theo in the kitchen doorway pressed his hand over his mouth. Holt wrote something in his notebook with slightly more energy than usual. Rowe gave Pax a look that said beautifully strange as clearly as words. The reporter looked around at all of them, sensing she'd missed something. "You're all friends?" she asked. Pax looked at Cade. Cade looked back, the gray eyes warm, the bracing gone. The man who'd once sat slumped in the rain against a market wall and accepted food from a stranger, now leaning against the counter of that stranger's stall, like it was exactly where he'd always belonged. "Yeah," Pax said. "Something like that." This story started with 3 men who had nothing and 1 boy who gave everything he had left, and every single one of them ended up with more than they started with. Love doesn't always look like a grand entrance. Sometimes it looks like a tray of food in the rain and a tin of gray paint and a hand held across a clean counter. This channel exists to tell you stories about the kind of love that builds slowly, honestly, and out loud, and we're just getting started. Welcome to the table.